Hello, welcome to this edition of Another Look. Um, Delighted to see you all here on a rainy evening. Very good to see you. So there's a character in the novel that we're going to be discussing tonight who his name is Boeing. I don't know how they pronounce that in French. Boang, maybe. But he's also known as the captain. And for 3 years, he was in the habit of taking note of the names of all the people who came into the Café Condé. In each case, he would jot down the date and the exact time. And he believed that in the maelstrom of a big city, with its uninterrupted stream of women, men, children, and dogs that continuously pass by and get lost from sight among the streets, you had to find some fixed points, as he calls them, right? Another Look is in its, what year is it? 16th year? Something like that. And I think it's fair to say that Another Look has now become a fixed point for the reading community that we've brought together here over the years, right? So with that preamble, many thanks to the sponsors. There's continuing studies we'd like to acknowledge, and the Humanities Center, obviously, for providing the venue for it. Very special thanks to Mary Pope Osborne, Katie Gibson, and Antonia Cross for their generous donations. We could not keep this book club going without that. Thanks to Robert Edgar, who oversees the live stream, records the sessions, edits the recordings, and then posts them on our YouTube channel. And finally, thanks as always to Cynthia Haven, who keeps Another Look running on all cylinders. So the author that we're discussing tonight, Patrick Modiano, I'm going to pronounce his name the way the French pronounce it. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2014. I had never heard of him before then. I think that a lot of people had not heard of him before then. And when I learned that most of his books were about post-occupation France, I thought to myself that the Nobel Prize Committee had no imagination and had decided to award an author of the past rather than of the present. I no longer believe that, in part because last year I finally read him, intrigued by the title of the book under discussion tonight, in the Café of Lost Youth. And I thought the novel was intriguing and interesting on my first reading. I passed it on to my sister, who loved it. Then I ran it by Cynthia Haven, who also loved it. And so we decided to select this novel for Another Look for the winter quarter of this year. I'll mention that about a month ago, I reread the book and had the impression that I hadn't really read it before. Or let's say I read it, but only a kind of sketch of it. I reread it for a third time this past week. And again, I felt like I was finally finding my way around its four-part narrative, its cast of characters, its oblique plot, its psychogeography, its reticence, and strange nocturnal vividness. I'm very impressed by it and now consider Modiano an immense writer. I mean that. I think he's an immense writer, even though, by his own admission, all of his books are reiterations of one book or of one story. It's a story of erasure and disappearance, of the vanishing traces of identity, memory, and the past. There's a character in one of his novels who declares, "I refuse to accept that people could disappear without a trace." And yet we know that people can disappear without a trace, and it happens all the time. This refusal to accept that motivates and informs most of Modiano's books. In an excellent review article in the Sydney Review of Books, which he founded, the renowned literary critic James Lay writes in the line that I just quoted, he writes of that line that I just quoted, that it can be read as a kind of mission statement for Modiano's work in general. So the cycle of flight and pursuit in his novels is driven by the mystery of other people. Characters are seeking to recover a lost past, seeking understanding and connection, or more often, reconnection. And in directing their searches outward, reaching back into history, striving to preserve whatever meager facts they are able to salvage, they are seeking a kind of resolution without really knowing what resolution might mean, what form it might take, or whether such a resolution is possible. So, a few things about Modiano's life before we get into our discussion. Paris is the main protagonist of Modiano's books. His memoir, he has a memoir called Pedigree, published in 2005. It begins with the following paragraph. I was born on July 30th, 1945, at 11 Allée Marguerite de Boulogne-Billancourt, to a Jewish man and a Flemish mother who had met in Paris under the occupation. I write Jewish without really knowing what that word meant to my father, and because at the time it was what appeared on the identity papers. Periods of great turbulence often lead to rash encounters with the result that I've never felt like a legitimate son, much less an heir. Modiano's father was a black marketeer who associated with various disreputable characters. His mother was an actress, a pretty girl with an arid heart, as he calls her. Neither father nor mother had any interest in Patrick or his younger brother. His father had a mysterious compulsion to push me away. As for his mother, I quote him, I seldom saw her. I can't recall a single act of genuine warmth or protectiveness from her. I was always on my guard around her. Her sudden flares of temper upset me deeply. Nothing softened the coldness and hostility she had always shown me. I was never able to confide in her or ask her for help of any kind. Modiano mentions that his mother once owned a lapdog that killed itself by leaping from a window. And he adds, I felt a great kinship with it. Patrick's brother died young, and then Patrick was sent off to a boarding school that, again, quoting, catered to the unloved, bastards, and lost children. By age 21, Modiano had cut off all relations with his parents. He left the school, fled from his own past, and turned to writing books about disinheritance, ungrounded identities, and what it means to be an orphan of history in a post-war world whose past survives only in incomplete traces. Modiano was intensely aware of how much in Paris had been destroyed, razed to the ground, as he says, and replaced with what he calls cement, the color of amnesia. And it's into that world of opaque fragments of the personal, historical, and civic past that we're going to be venturing into in our session tonight. So with that preamble, I'm now going to introduce our panelists. First up is Dr. Chloe Summers Edmondson. She's a lecturer in Stanford's Department of French and Italian, where she teaches a wide array of courses, including courses on Paris and French café culture. Chloe received her PhD in French studies here at Stanford in 2020. She works at the crossroads of literary criticism, cultural history, and media studies. with a focus on Ancien Régime France. She's published in Studies in 18th Century Culture, the Journal of Modern History, Digital Humanities Quarterly, and in the Oxford University Studies in the Enlightenment series. Following Chloe will be Rehm. Rehm is a director and a Stanford Professor Emeritus of Classics, as well as Theater and Performance Studies. He has directed many memorable plays, from Greek tragedies to Shakespeare, all the way up to Samuel Beckett and beyond. He is the author of several outstanding books, among others, Greek Tragic Theater, Marriage to Death, and Radical Theater, Greek Tragedy in the Modern World. Tobias Wolff always seems to get the short end of it, because I always assume that he doesn't need any introduction to this audience. Tobias is the founder of Another Look, and one of the truly major American novelists and short story writers, author of books like A Boy's Life, In Pharaoh's Army, and The Barrack Thief. In 2015, he was awarded the National Medal of Honor, not of honors, but National Medal of Arts by Barack Obama. So we're going to be going in that order, starting with you, Chloe, if you don't mind.
It's working. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Robert, for the introduction and for the invitation to be here tonight, talking about Patrick Modiano's novel, which, as you mentioned, intersects with two foci of courses that I teach here at Stanford. One loosely around the theme of the café as an institution of French intellectual culture, and another on the city of Paris, its history, and its representation in literature. Before diving into Modiano's novel and his portrayal of the café, I'm going to speak briefly about the history of the café in Paris to contextualize why the café is so strongly associated with Paris and specifically with French intellectual culture. There are famous cafes in Paris that you may have heard of, like Les Deux Magots and the Café de Flore, which are known for having been regular meeting places of famous intellectuals like the existentialists, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus. But the café as a gathering site for intellectuals was not a 20th century invention. In the 6th arrondissement, not far from Modiano's Café de Condé, is the Café Prof, the first and oldest café in Paris, founded in 1686. And the Café Prof, which still exists to this day, became a gathering place for artists and intellectuals, in large part due to its proximity to the Comédie Française, which was nearby the theater. And in the 18th century, it was frequented by men of letters like Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and even Americans like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. And in the 19th century, the literary tradition continued with frequent regulars at the Prof like Georges Sand, Balzac, and Victor Hugo. Ostensibly sites for drinking coffee, the café was an important milieu not only for social interaction, but also for discussion, debate, reading, and sharing the news. Cafes were integral places of sociability, with theoreticians like Jürgen Habermas arguing that they played a central role in the development of public opinion and of the public sphere in the 18th century. And notably, the café was a space that required no invitation. Anyone could frequent the café at any hour of the day and spend time there alone or with others. The course I have taught at Stanford was cheekily entitled Coffee and Cigarettes, the Making of French Intellectual Culture. If we imagine a French intellectual, the image that often comes to mind is the cliché of an individual in a café, likely with a book, but it's also the image often of an intellectual smoking a cigarette, gazing out at the world deep in thoughts. And while the café can evoke the social and discursive side of the intellectual, cigarettes evoke the more individualistic side of being deep in thought and seeking inspiration. This cliché also invites a desire for imitation, to project oneself as incarnating the type of the intellectual through one's habits and through one's self-presentation. Tobacco use, alcohol, and drugs have often been seen as sources of artistic and intellectual inspiration. If you take, for instance, Baudelaire or Hemingway, who are known for their consumption of alcohol, opium, and absinthe. But in the Condé, Modiano captures many of these defining features of Parisian cafe culture. The cafe as a place for the solitary individual with a book, the cafe as a site for socializing and drinking, where friends meet and gather, and its association with the figure of the intellectual. So what do we learn about the Condé specifically as a cafe in the opening pages of the novel? The first few sentences describe the Condé and its regulars, who were between 19 and 25 years old. Its regular clientele tend to be young, referred to as strange and as stray dogs. Situated at the Carrefour de l'Odéon in the 6th arrondissement of the left bank, the Condé was in the, quote, sheltered world of literature and the arts. We learned that the regulars of the Condé had books with them that they would set down nonchalantly on the table before them, the covers stained with wine. The narrator reflects that Lucie, quote, must have wanted to be like the others. And one day at the Condé, he came upon her alone reading. After that, she was never without her book. It was as if this book were her passport or a residence permit that legitimized her presence by their sides. Already this idea of needing a passport in the form of a book to be admitted to the Condé suggests a certain identity that one must possess, or at least project. Lucie starts carrying a book with her. The narrator hides that he is a student of the École des Mines. Contrary to a typical student clientele, we learned that the regulars of the Condé drank much more, and we also learned that it became the meeting place of what a romantic philosopher once called the lost youth, invoking the title for the first and possibly only time, which is something I would love for us to discuss further. From these early pages, it's clear that the Condé has a distinct identity vis-a-vis the other cafes in Paris, and especially vis-a-vis the other cafes that are referenced in the novel. We also learned some other important details. The regulars came from all over Paris, and they did not know much about each other's lives outside of the Condé. I will also underline that the location of the Condé at the Carrefour de l'Odéon in the 6th geographically is a sort of midpoint in Paris, especially in relation to many other neighborhoods that are mentioned, whether the areas on the far west, like Neuilly, the Bois de Boulogne, and Auteuil, the northwest, Étoile and the Champs-Élysées, or the Pigalle-Montmartre areas to the north. The first narrator suggests that the Condé constituted a sort of refuge for Lucie, but also for others. He shares the impression that she was taking refuge there at the Condé as if she were running from something. But Lucie is not the only one for whom the Condé serves as a refuge. The first narrator also adds, for me, the Condé was a refuge from all the drabness I anticipated in life. There will one day be a part of me, the best part, that I will be forced to leave behind there, also suggesting a link between a part of his identity and the cafe. The character and narrator Roland also speaks of the Condé as a sort of refuge, as a sanctuary that he frequents in the 6th arrondissement, despite his desire to, quote, avoid running into the ghosts on the rive gauche. Modiano also introduces the idea that there are certain places that have a magnetic pole. He writes, I've always believed that certain places are like magnets and draw you towards them should you happen to walk within their radius. It seems to me that because of its location, the Condé had that sort of magnetic power. Each of these characters finds their way into the core group of regulars of the Condé, and in so doing, derive a sense of belonging there. A place where a fragment of their identities, at least, can find moments of joy, of an escape, either from the past or from a present that they wish to run from. This question of identity and belonging to specific sites in Paris, streets, neighborhoods, is at the core of this novel. The entire novel is permeated by a duality of a desire to fix people, experiences, places in time and to hold on to them, and the fleeting nature of lived experience, particularly in a big urban metropolis. That specificity of the urban environment is first presented to us under the guise of Bowen's philosophy, what Robert quoted, the fact that in this maelstrom of a large city, you have to find a few fixed points. And especially in his project to document the comings and goings of the cafe goers throughout Paris, to quote, combat the anonymity of the big city by filling the pages of his notebook with names. And this really underscores a core tension of Modiano's novel, which is the compulsion to anchor fixed points, but also the futility of it. The frustration of the narrator in describing Bowen's project is his wish that Bowen had captured more information in his Clairefontaine notebook about the individual's identities frequenting the cafe. In Modiano's Paris, the narrative seems to oscillate between precisely this theme of anonymity in the city and the escape it can afford, but also the city seems to provide the only sources of anchors for these wandering young people. Anchors found in cafes, in bookstores, and fleetingly in each other. Individuals derive a sense of belonging not only through sites like the Condé, but also perhaps above all with different neighborhoods. And this sense of belonging is fundamentally fragmentary, both temporally, but also spatially. There are fragmented present identities scattered throughout the city, but also past selves left behind in different neighborhoods. The entire project of the novel is to try to piece together this enigmatic Luki, whose identity is fragmented all over Paris. There's the Luki of the Condé, the married Luki of Neuilly and Auteuil, and the Luki of her childhood and adolescence in Pigalle and Montmartre. Modiano's Paris is not a map, but a tapestry of each character's subjectivity. The streets, metro stops, cafes, and neighborhoods are woven together with the characters' past and present lives. Belonging and escape seem to coexist, depending on what neighborhood you happen to find yourself in. Paris is also portrayed as a place divided along rigid boundaries that cannot be permeated and across which identities cannot move. There are critical distinctions evoked between the left bank and the right bank, between the Sits de Saint-Germain-des-Prés and the nice Pigalle. These neighborhoods in their own way become refuges precisely due to this quality. Luki reflects, if I wasn't worried that I might run into certain ghosts, I would quite happily return to that place one night in order to better understand where I come from. One can leave an identity behind in a neighborhood and keep that identity in the past so long as you no longer cross that boundary. The detective, Chesley, who is trying to piece together Luki's life, is very aware of this. He remarks, I took the metro, the north-south line, as they call it, the one that connected Avenue Rachel to the Condé. As the stations passed by, I traveled back in time. I got off at Pigalle. Traveled back in time obviously refers to traveling back in Luki's life to her childhood. It's also curious that he refers to the metro as the vehicle that enables this time travel into different lives of an individual. Similarly, when Roland realizes that Luki will never go back to her husband, he expresses this through a reference to the metro. He says, I understood that she would never again take the metro out to Sablon. And indeed, the metro lines and stops seem to delimit specific lives. When Luki laments about feeling stuck in her marriage, she conceptualizes that as, quotes, being doomed to keep taking the same line of the metro home until the end of her days. Transfer à l'Étoile, get off at Sablon. If Paris lets you inhabit different lives in different neighborhoods, the only threat to this is when people commit the taboo of crossing one of these boundaries, like Mucellini from the Cantor in Pigalle being spotted at La Pergola in the Sixth. Luki, quote, had used the words rive gauche as if the Seine were a dividing line separating two different cities, some sort of iron curtain. And the man at La Pergola had somehow managed to cross over that boundary. And we learned that La Pergola wasn't like the other cafes in the area. It was pretty much an annex to Pigalle that just happened to be in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. But coming to the end of my time, I want to propose a few different topics for further discussion. There's a clear counterpoint in the novel to this idea of rigid boundaries with Roland's concept of the neutral zones, which he defines as transitional zones in Paris, no man's lands, Within, we benefited from a certain kind of immunity. He even dedicates this draft manuscript to Luki of the neutral zones. These in-between zones in the periphery of the city allow you to not only be anonymous, but also notably, these neutral zones have no fixed identity. So this suggests that there are liminal parts of the city where you can float freely and find refuge. But the concept of the neutral zones is also distinct from a separate motif whereby characters do cross over between neighborhoods, not through escape like Luki, escaping from Pigalle or Neuilly, but rather through the motif of wandering. The wandering also stands in juxtaposition with transit by metro. It often takes place at night, after the last metro, sometimes following the same paths, and even at times walking under the elevated outdoor segments of the metro heard overhead. And I hope that we can discuss some of these scenes of wandering through the city, especially of Luki and Roland's wanderings across neighborhoods, because to me, these are some of the dreamiest scenes in the novel, and Modiano truly captures the feeling of moving through the city. And lastly, because Modiano's Paris is so bound up in questions of identity and belonging, I think it's important to reflect on what it means that this Paris, which provides the anchor and the sense of belonging for these characters, is no more permanent than the characters themselves, who disappear, who lose track of each other, and who ultimately even die. The streets remain, but the fixed points, the cafes, the bookstores, the people disappear, and the identity of the neighborhoods themselves change. So I look forward to hearing the thoughts of the other panelists and to our discussion. Thank you.
I didn't know anything about Patrick Modiano until Robert asked me to fill in for someone who couldn't be here. And I am thrilled because I love this book. Why do I love it? Because it's short. And as Robert used the word, which I wouldn't have thought of, but I love it, it's immense. It's remarkably interwoven in an extraordinary way. You might want to ask yourself when I read it, first of all, it took me a while to figure out there were 4 different speakers, and I finally figured that out. But also, what kind of a book is it? And at a certain level, you might think, well, it's kind of like a sort of a mystery story because there's a private detective. There's all these underlife of bad guys, Mussolini's other people. There are drugs. There's a suicide. There are false names being used, and you could go on and on. But it's not, and there's a private detective in it. But I don't think it's that kind of a mystery. I think it's, if I can sort of give a big name to it, it seems something sort of like an existential mystery. And I think that the author sort of brackets that. The first narrator is a student, as Chloe mentioned, and he says about his memory, if this whole period still endures in my memory, it's because of questions that have remained unanswered. And then if you jump to the end and you remember when Guy de Vere asked Roland about the suicide of Lutmi, he says, I never understood why. And then he says, what a stupid question, Guy de Vere says. He says, when we really love someone, we've got to accept their role in the mystery. And that's why we love them, isn't it? So you got this sort of notion that mystery is around it, and the nation is what kind of a mystery is it? Well, clearly it focuses on all 4 of them. Everybody likes Luki, by the way. You can go through it and see all the different people who like her and think she's cool and all that. But she's clearly the centerpiece. And I thought, if you have your book, we just open to page 76, 77. Oh, let's go to the English one. I'll just sort of breeze through some of this, because what I really want to talk about is the importance of writing and the written word in the book. And it's not like the book is completely self-reflexive about writing, but boy, oh boy, when you start latching on to how often it appears, it is everywhere. So page 676, she's talking about a book that Guy de Vere gave her, The Lost Horizons, okay? And I'm reading in the middle of the page. A story about some people climbing the mountains of Tibet in search of the monastery of Shangri-La to learn great wisdom and the meaning of life. But it's not worth the trouble going so far. I thought back to my nighttime walks. For me, Montmartre was Tibet. So go back to what Chloe was saying. There's something books can offer, but also walking imagining your own is there. And I could go on about that. But on the next page, another book pops up, which I'll get to. So she's talking about, well, that's the bottom of the page, bottom of page 76. She's talking about that she's never going to go back to a bar she used to go to, or cafe she used to go to, the Cantor. Bottom of the page. Later, I revisited that same intoxication every time I broke off all ties with someone. I was never really myself when I wasn't running away. My only happy memories are memories of flight and escape. Okay, and then she talks about walking, a little further on that page. I walked on, impatient to reach the end of the street, where there was nothing but blue sky and the void. What word would have best described my state of mind, intoxication, ecstasy, rapture? Soon I would reach the cliff's edge and I would throw myself into the void. And of course, this is in anticipation of what she will do at the end of the book, which you don't know until you read the end of the book. You have to reread the book to get that, I think. But at the bottom of the page, you'll see what she does. Well, she feels like she's just has this clarity of vision about freedom and release, happiness to float through the air. And then she says, and then life went on with its ups and downs. And if you read the book again, you'll see there's ups and downs all over the book, literal ups and downs. Walking upstairs, walking downstairs, not taking the elevator, taking steps. It's all over the place. So there's a kind of literal version of it, as well as a metaphorical one. Anyway, one dismal day, I felt particularly down as I flipped through the book Guy de Vere had lent me, another book, Louise, Sister of the Void. I used a ballpoint pen to replace her name on the cover with my own, Jacqueline, Sister of the Void. Yeah, talk about falling in ups and downs. There you go. So you get the idea that she takes this book and then she, in a sense, rewrites it by putting her name on the title. Now, if you go back to earlier on in the beginning of her beginning descriptions of her youth, remember she's picked up by the cops as an adolescent walking the neighborhood, and let's see if I can find what she says. In any event, she talks about she's very happy. I hope I can find this. She's very happy that the policemen are writing this down. Yeah, it's on page 58. I was relieved to see that he was taking notes. If everything was written in black and white, that meant it was over, the same way names and dates are inscribed on headstones. Okay. So right now it means it's dead. And of course, cemeteries are also all over the book, walking through cemeteries all over the place. Okay, but then she says, actually, I would like to start again. And I wish, I'm just paraphrasing, I wish he would mark out everything he's written. I would have preferred he had crossed out everything. I was prepared to give him other details and other names. That is to say, I will now reinvent myself. You go back to the reference to the Boeing book that Robert and Chloe both mentioned. And the student, as Chloe mentioned, talks about the fact that he's written all this stuff down, but he then says, he wanted to name and fix us somewhere. I wish he'd been more precise, including a short bio. Did he really believe that a name and an address would later be enough to keep track of a life? And especially when the names weren't real. And of course, all these people are named. How did Lukey get her name? Do you remember who named her? Tarzan named her. Okay, now where do you get that name, So, and even Roland, who's her boyfriend, ends up telling us that his name he had too exotic a name, didn't want to use that name, so he came up with an everyday name that was very French. So you get all of these references to names and nicknames and made-up names. But then there are other names that are quite real. So now we go to the private detective, who's actually interested in real names. What does he notice when he's going to track down, he's being hired by the husband. He's going to track down Lukey for the husband. So page 34. What does he see? The small golden plaque on the door read Jean-Pierre Chauveau. There's his name. And the husband wonders, was I ever really married? Well, what tells him he's really married? He has a sole remaining proof was a family record book that he had. The detective then gets a letter from his pal Blamont with a birth certificate. He again tries to track down where she lived in these different hotels, and on one of them is pasted a list of names he's written down. So he's tracking down all of these names. Then you go back to another character in the Condé, who was only mentioned a few times, named Davala, and he says about that Boeing notebook, it's almost like a police register or a precinct logbook. It's as if we had all been taken in a raid. So now these names are becoming, ways in which you can be picked up or caught. Well, there are many other references to this sort of idea, and I'll just throw out a few, and then I'll try to get to some more interesting conclusions. If you remember, one of the ways in which these written words are present is an aide-de-memoire. So Roland keeps a photocopy of the lecture that at one of the nights of Guy de Vere. He also keeps a list of all of her books that he gave. If you remember, he actually was given the book on the Eternal Return by Guy de Vere, which pops up, and of course, I won't talk about the Eternal Return, but it's all over the book. Now, Roland actually thinks he knows why Lucy reads. And part of the reading is to have to show you belong in another lookbook. You've got a book. But he says the following: she hoped to discover some meaning to life within them. These are the sort of self-help books and the sort of mystical spiritual books that Guy de Vere gives her. Whereas for me, it was just the sound of the words and the music and sentences. So she's looking for sort of meaning of life out of these books, like many of us do. When we read a book, maybe we'll get better or learn something like that. And then he rethinks and he says, but more than a code of conduct, quote, she wanted to escape, to run farther and further away, to break violently with her everyday life, to finally be able to breathe. Now that's his version of her reading a book. But remember where I started, she's reading James Hilton, I think it's James Hilton. Anyway, the Shangri-La book. And she doesn't need that at all to breathe. She just needs to get out and walk. So you get a sense in which the way the books move through. Now, I'll just do a quick little tour. There are actually three authors that are, well, actually more, but three authors that I did a little research on that are not young. They are also in the Condé. The first one is Arthur Adamov. Arthur Adamov was a brilliant guy. He lived from, I think, 1908 to 1970. Cafe Society guy. He started out as an absurdist writer, surrealist and absurdist, and Martin Esslin, teacher of mine, has a big chapter in Theater of the Absurd about Arthur Adamov. He translated Dostoevsky, he translated Buchner, he translated Gorky, he translated Chekhov. This guy was, smart. He wrote a lot of books, and if you remember, he later then moved aside from absurdism. Very interesting. And he became a political writer after the Algerian War, and he kind of Brechtian theater, absolutely the opposite of the sort of soulful but non-committed writing. And it made me think a little bit, although I think it's hard to find, is there any politics in this book? And the answer is probably not, but when you start digging a little bit, all these interesting Algerians and Moroccans, they sort of pop up, but it's not clearly important. And if you remember, he actually pops up in the book in an important way, because Lucy will walk him home at night because he's afraid of walking home in the dark. Okay. The next author is a guy named Maurice Raphael in the novel. You remember him? He pops up a little more often. His actual real name, that was not his real name. His real name was Victor Marie Lepage. He lived from 1918 to 1977. He started out writing a sort of surrealist books. Breton liked some of his writing. And then he changed his name in 1954, and he started writing crime novels, okay, under the name Angèle Bastiani. And then later he used other pseudonyms, Zep Cassini, Vic Volière, Luigi da Costa. Now these are the real people, but now you get to see a sort of reality underneath the cafe world that these younger people are sort of associating themselves with. Roland says, like Adamov and Laurent, I'll say something about him in a minute, he had published several books, but he never spoke of them to us. There was a mystery surrounding him, and we even thought he had ties with the underworld. And Lucy herself says, never in a million years would I have guessed this man was a writer. Okay, but remember, he's the one who mentioned he takes her home and a kid home on the other side of Montparnasse, and he's the one who gives the name, you live in limbo, right? And some other times he pops up. The last writer only occurs a couple of times in the book is Olivier Leronde. He lived in 1927 and 1965. He was a poet, and he died young. He was a friend of Genet and Jean Cocteau, so I imagine he was homosexual gay. But anyway, his first volume of poetry was called Les Barricades Mystérieuses, the mysterious barricades. And then another book, the title of which is actually an anagram of his own name. So you get the idea. Anyway, he died of opium addiction, alcohol addiction, and destitute and solitary, and in 1965. Okay, so what do I want to make of that? Well, I mean, first of all, there are real people in the book, and these people merge in with them as well as real places. If you want to think about all of the writing in the book, you might also just think about all the ways in which writing directs people. The metro sign, the street signs, it's all over the place. I mean, naming. But I was intrigued by one final passage I just look at real quickly, and that is the detective. And one of his friends says to him, Kingsley, you should have been a writer. You should have been a novelist, he says. And I want to find this because it's important. Let me just hold on a second. Where is he? Because he says something very, very interesting about writing. Yes. So remember, he's tracking her down, but then he becomes a protector of Luki, right? He's not going to tell the husband where she lives. There's wonderful lines about, I'm going to protect her till the end, he basically says. It's a weird foreshadowing. But this is something that he says, in a sense, reflecting about his own work, but I'd like to think it's also a reflection of writing and reading. So I'm quoting him. By what right do we intrude, forcing our way in like common crooks? And by what presumptuousness do we delve into their heads and hearts and ask them to account for themselves? By what authority? And I think that Modiano might be in that little moment, be asking himself as a writer, what are you doing? Trying to get inside these people. And also as a reader, what do we think we're doing?
Well, as has been so well pointed out tonight, this book takes the form of a mystery. We have a missing person, we have a detective, and this mystery is never solved because as we progress in this novel, we see the real mystery, which is often frustrating, is in the character of the people, the characters of the people, which have a kind of instability about them. They're hard to pin down. They are not characterized in the usual novelistic way. It's hard to get a fix. This whole thing about fixed points that applies as much to the characters in this novel, it seems to me, as to the geographies of Paris. And so there's a kind of uncertainty, a pall of uncertainty over this novel all the time. Someone who's supposed to be an art publisher is not an art publisher. The description of Luki making her way through a day is actually an imagined event. It's a writer imagining something, or a detective rather imagining something as if he were a writer, in the captain's notebook, Boeing, this so-called fixed points, everything in fact is vague and slipping away. in there, nothing fixed, nothing that you can hold down. The student is not a student. And Jeanette Gall, is she really a dancer? There seems to be some, there's certainly a question about that. These business ventures are black holes. So one of the characters says, importantly, I think, I am never really myself when I'm not running away. And there is that elusiveness, I think, that refusal to connect, to be fixed, that characterizes the people in this novel. And building on that, the narrator says, we have to accept their role in the mystery. And that demands us ask, what mystery is there? In a kind of interesting way, some of the vagueness and uncertainty that surrounds these characters is interrupted now and then by reference to real people who are living here. Say the novelist James Jones, who lived in Paris for years with his wife Gloria, the wonderful novelist, wrote From Here to Eternity, The Pistol, Whistle, other books. Wonderful novelist, and it gives a kind of ballast of reality that is really a kind of pretend reality, but it gives the book a kind of solidity to encounter these actual people, as the geography of Paris so often evoked in here, this place, that rue, give also a kind of sense of solidity to this dream of a book that's floating above all this. Maybe I'll just sit back now. We can talk about this a bit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. So you've all put into play a lot of different motifs, and I guess as a moderator, I'm under some kind of pressure to
come up with something, Robert.
But I think one thing that comes through all, the comments is that we're dealing with something elusive. That's your word for it. The elusiveness, and there's a certain emptiness. I think with Rush, the quote about the void, Luki's attraction to that void, and it ends up that she does, her jouissance is to actually let herself fall off the balcony into the void. And I suppose that you probably have to live in a big city like Paris in order to have this daily experience of knowing people for the most part, very partially, and with all this sort of opacity in the background of the people you meet, the social relations you have, how much we don't know about not only others, but ultimately about ourselves. And I think Modiano is always bringing back to the particular self, which is baffled by how much he or she doesn't understand about the world and others and the city, that it goes back to into themselves, where that I am a stranger to myself at a certain point. No? So I think along with elusiveness and emptiness, I think deracination is this rootlessness, being uprooted, is part of a general shared condition. And I think the cafe, to go back, to Chloe's saying, that the cafe has a strange, almost magical role in bringing together what the city has sundered apart. which is an unusual sort of dynamic because it can only be temporary. It can't be the substitute for a true home or a place of belonging. It can only be a kind of temporary place of identification. I think that's interesting when you think in terms of the motif of the eternal return, which comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, where he has the hypothesis that everything that has happened will recur eternally, time and time again. Because he even tried to defend this scientifically by saying that if time is infinite and matter is finite, then every possible combination of matter has to have occurred an infinite number of times. And I think there's a certain point at which Roland and Chloe, where they're in a class, and he realizes that that she's going to disappear. He knows that she's fugitive, she's going to disappear, but when he thinks of the eternal return, he says, there we were. He takes her arm, or she takes his arm, and we were there eternally for that one moment. So this kind of marriage between the momentary and eternity is something that kind of takes the place of the traditional forms of belonging, namely being rooted in a very strong identity that goes back to your family, the region where you come from, and your class, and all these sort of things. So I would, hope that this brings together some of the things that the three of you have put into play with your presentations.
Perhaps not a particularly interesting point on it, but it is intriguing that in the Eternal Return, Roland actually mentions indirectly, he picks up a pocketbook on the quay, called Heart of Summer. And when he is rethinking about this eternal return, he's thinking, we were planning a holiday in Mallorca or Mexico. The places no longer mattered. The lone goal of our journey was to the heart of summer. This many, many pages later. So there's a way in which this is fed into his imagination. And then, as you pointed out, he imagines on this stroll through the Auteuil that they'd already been doing this thousands and thousands of years. But you can contrast that notion, this eternal return, as sometimes you could see that as a wonderful, never-ending kind of perdurance of something. But of course, as you pointed out, Chloe, that wonderful passage where Roland is, the question is she going to go home tonight? And he says, oh, there she is at the metro. It's going to be the same metro line, the same stop, the same thing. And so then the question, so her thing was to get out of the sameness and the eternal return, get away from it. And of course, her whole, I'm exaggerating a bit, but her desire for escape is, in a sense, to escape away from repetition. She doesn't want that. And so if you're talking about poles, I'd say they're poles, and of course both of them are in some sense imaginary, not real. One other thing I wanted to say about the vagueness and all that, which is absolutely true, and Toby, you're absolutely right. Somehow you're looking for, traditionally looking, I want to know more about that person. Why don't I know? I mean, when I read it the first time, I was surprised, even saddened, shocked that Lucy had killed herself. I mean, and he certainly was. If you read it again, you'll see there are tons and not tons, but there are ways in which death is rolling through that. Remember, crossbones and cemetery, and some description I read earlier on about going to the void. You don't see it the first time, but for all of its vagueness, it is remarkably detailed. And I mean, as you were pointing out, all the street names, the specificities are all over the book. It's very, very high. So it seems to be something like you can get at the world through specifics, but it doesn't actually doesn't get you there in a way. And I mean, I just found that like interesting. I don't really know what to make of it, but I do think that it's vague, but it's vague built on remarkable sets of specificities. And as you pointed out, just absolutely locked into neighborhoods and areas and subway lines. And we were talking at dinner, and probably all of us have, and probably some of you have had moments where, oh, I know where that is in Paris. Remember the Jardin de Luxembourg, where he's walking through and there's a death warrant on the trees, another written thing about the trees are going to die. You know what I mean? So I bet probably many of you have been walking through it. You go, oh my God, I've been there. So I do think that is another way that the book works on our memory.
Chloe, you want to?
I think that, Robert, what you're talking about in terms of the, the way in which the way in which identity is so it's so hard to pin down, and I think that that's where I was a bit puzzled by the neutral zones as a concept, because I think that when you read the description by Roland of the neutral zones, it seems to be he identifies these specific places like the square Campon and Ségur and these specific areas that he sees as kind of in the peripheries and where it's a no man's land. But in doing a bit of research on Modiano and this novel, it seems that some interpretations of the idea of the neutral zones also include some of these fixed sites like the cafes, and the concept that there's these places where you can have an identity that's different and that's partial, like what you were saying, how you can cross paths with all these people and only really know them partially. Like the person that in the Condé, but you don't know anything about them outside. And I'm curious your interpretations about the neutral zones, and what is it kind of the literal definition that Roland gives us of these kind of peripheral areas that kind of between the main neighborhoods, or is it more of this kind of concept of these places where you can exist partially in an anonymity within the city?
One thing that Maurice Raphael says, remember another thing about writing, I mean, Roland is ostensibly writing a book on the neutral zones, right? He's writing a book. And there's a little passage where he's remember, he never finishes the book, he carries on a typewriter and he never finishes it. But Raphael, he asked Raphael, what do you think of the title? I'm thinking of changing it to Free Zone. And Raphael says, well, basically it's your call, but I think neutral's better. So there's something, taking away, we're not going to call it free, that would be too much. But what it is a good question. One of the things that interested me about the fact that the cafe seems to be such a fixed point, and it is, but really not that much of the book takes place in the cafe. And, I mean, there's not like a cafe scene, there's some, but it's really, so it is a place where you can think about all these people when they're not in the cafe. Anyway, I mean, you're making a movie of this book. I don't know what you do, but you would be doing it a disservice if you said your own cafe. Well, so I mean, what is a neutral zone? I think one point they asked, is a cemetery a neutral zone? I think he asked that at some point, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. There's limbo on the other side of Montparnasse Cemetery, so I don't know what that is. But neutral zones are also connected, maybe it's connected. No, it's not connected.
It's a place of indeterminacy between one well-defined neighborhood and another. And in that sense, it seems to be a figure for this non-belonging, that in the neutral zone, you don't belong to either one side or the other. And therefore it stands for identity in the metropolitan context, where it seems like we all, well, many of us would have our identities located in a neutral zone rather than in a place that is racinated or rooted in kind of traditional permanence. And,
it's a psychological state, not something that can be put on a map, right. Known by neighborhood in that way. Just psychology of the person.
And I would say this about Modiano, that I'm really impressed by him because he's a European writer and he's a Parisian, and therefore he's, in some sense, he belongs to the very center of the Western, I don't want to say canon, but in some sense it's, so I think that modern literature, 20th century post-war, at least in the last 50, 60, 70 years, that the whole center of gravity, it's almost like oxymoronic to say that, but it's shifted away from the center to the peripheries of culture. So it's no longer the West, and it's certainly not Rome, Paris, Madrid, these kind of places. Very little literature that seems to have the vibrancy of something urgent to say is coming out of the centers. And how difficult it is to become a writer speaking from a particular center, as Paris is traditionally understood, how difficult that is. And I think that he can pull it off because he understands the degree to which Paris is no longer identical to itself. We've talked about this, before coming on tonight, in various conversations, not only tonight, but with Chloe and others, that everyone has a memory of Paris, of what it used to be, which it is no longer. And you can go back, this would go back, even Baudelaire was lamenting the fact that Paris was not what it was because now of all the development. And when Hemingway and the great American writers were in Paris, it was a different thing than in the 50s. For us, the 50s, Belmondo, that kind of Paris is a real thing. I lived in Paris for 2 years in the 80s. I just heartbroken 20 years later to see that I don't recognize that Paris anymore. And of course, Modiano, who grew up and is a native of a ground that is where you can no longer be a native, is a kind of testament to this complete evanescence of a city that has had an identity. And does it still have the identity? I mean, Chloe is, much more optimistic on that. She said, yes, Paris is still Paris. I think when you're young, Paris will always be Paris. But
the logic of that, Paris hasn't changed.
But I think in some ways, it's always the Paris of your youth, in the sense, and that's why I think everybody experiences this sense of loss for the Paris that once was, because I think, everybody has these kind of, that's why Hemingway says, I'm paraphrasing, but there's that quote about, if you're lucky enough to live in Paris as a young man, like you keep Paris with you forever. And I think that there's a way in which the experiences you have in such a city mark you so profoundly that then when that city does change, and it inevitably does, then it's never the same. It's always experienced as a sense of loss because it's not the Paris of when you were experiencing those memories. But I think there's a great quote on 107 about this, where towards the end, it says, I was left on my own in front of the Place de Condé leather shop. I pressed my forehead to the window in an effort to see if any trace whatsoever remained of the cafe. A section of wall, the rear door that led to the telephone, the spiral staircase that led to Madame Chedley's little apartments. Nothing. Everything was stark and featureless, covered with an orange fabric, and the whole neighborhood was like that. At least there was no longer any reason to worry about running into ghosts. The ghosts themselves were dead. No need for concern on the way out of the metro at Mabillon, no more La Pedrola, and no more Mocellini lurking in the window. And I think that really encapsulates, this loss. And it's, the Café of Lost Youth. It's also a lost Paris as well.
Edith Wharton's characters are constantly lamenting the fact that this isn't my New York, right? This isn't the New York I grew up in, and that might, it's.
But I thought
the universal,
what the lost youth of the title, and I'm wondering if it's that these characters, these narrators, are thinking back to a youth that they had in those years. But I'm more persuaded that they never had it, that they were deprived of a proper youth because of the war, because of the time, and that they go into the Condé because they didn't have, the kind of youth or they're all seem to be orphans of a certain sort. Their parents are not, they have alienated from their parents, and that therefore these are people who have been deprived of a youth as we traditionally understand it, and therefore it's the Café of Lost Youth, of those who had already, when young, did not have a youth. That's one way of reading that. Yeah.
But these places were, before the war. You think of 18th century England, for example. The coffee shops were, cultural nexus. Johnson and Goldsmith and Boswell, they'd go there and they'd even write in there because they could get free paper. and paper was expensive. And in fact, they would get one of them, I forget which one, I think it was Boswell, got some reams of paper that he was supposed to pay for, and he was writing some of his accounts of his life with Johnson, and couldn't pay for it, so ran out of the coffee shop with the pages that he'd written and borrowed from, supposedly bought from the library, and was chased down the street. But those coffee houses were really a feature of a kind of cultural life, or
cultural life and exchange of ideas, and therefore they were politically subversive, because the difference between a cafe and a tavern is that taverns induce inebriation, cafes, induce lucidity and clear thinking. And that's why one of the kings of England, Charles, I don't know which Charles, he closed down, I think,
that's
about
right.
1,000 of them. He called them seminaries of sedition, because people would get together and talk. And when you talk, the principle of reason tends to come out in
which isn't friendly to monarchy.
right.
But it is interesting that I don't think we don't have any extended conversation in Café Condé.
Yeah,
No,
it's not that sort of thing. Yeah. I mean,
it's a place of escape, really.
Yeah, or a way of reconstituting your identity at not much cost, because you don't have to give too much away.
Yeah.
In fact, you have to keep it. Yeah, like, I guess bars are like, I don't know. When we talk about, I must say, the place that came to my mind is Vienna. Cafe Society. I mean, people, writers used to basically have their offices in the cafe, and people would come and talk to them about that. But should go back to this is puzzling me, because I mean, I went to Paris when I was young and all that. I remember things, but for me, and I realize that the book does foreground the fact that the buildings aren't the same. The Condé is now a leather shop, Prince de Condé, I think it's called. And the mother's home is no longer there, though she lived in the country. There are lots of discussions about destroyed buildings. But when I go back, I wonder if you do that when you go back to a place you used to live as a kid, some way you go. And it amazes me that the building's still there. Do you know what I mean? That there's with all the changes, something is still there. And how is it possible? Well, I sort of remember how it was. Well, they did this, they did that, but it's still. So for me, it's the continuation of, to be blunt, architecture that blows my mind. And believe me, there are tons and tons of buildings in Paris that were there 120 years ago. And that's what I see. I don't see the ones that aren't there, because I don't see them go. So and then also the metro lines. I mean, they're the same connections. They're the same Guimard, signs. There's the same. So there is something about if there wasn't a continuation of Paris, and it wouldn't. I don't. I mean, the book can bewail what's missing, but it works on the fact that it isn't all missing. I mean, it depends on that. Anyway.
Very good. So, please.
So the connections are there, because the metro line's the same. It's been expanded probably, but where it drops you off, where it doesn't deliver you to the same places.
We were remarking earlier that one of the fixed points in Paris is never mentioned. It's the Eiffel Tower. I mean, if there's one fixed point, now the Eiffel Tower is probably going to remain, for centuries to come. But it doesn't mean it's the same Eiffel Tower. And when you go there, I mean, it's at a certain point, some of these places that have survived become parodies of themselves.
Yeah.
They're going to become.
It would have been too obvious.
Everyone wants. You go to Père Lachaise, and there's an army of people that are all going to visit the great Jim Morrison, and it can't. That's not a cemeterial space anymore.
Well, not that that's gray, but at the other, I mean, there's, lots of other grays there that are great side. I mean,
There's Proust and yeah, but it has become a different kind of place than it was. Not just because of the Morrison grave, but because people want to go see.
Well, that's true. They go as tourists. I went as a tourist.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yes.
Question about Lucy.
Hold on, can you wait for the microphone?
I appreciate everything you've said. I found the book elusive and rather uninteresting. One of the reasons I think is Lukey. I found her very uninteresting as a character, and I wondered if anybody would like to talk about that, because the book is focused on her, on finding her, and yet to me she's vapid and not interesting. And when she killed herself, I wasn't surprised, because she has nothing going for her, which may be the point of the book, that many of these characters are just elusive and looking for something. But I was interested in what you'd have to say about her.
Yeah, I would. I have the same reading as you of that. There's an emptiness that I guess the other characters are filling in. It is not, but she is not in the way we would usually expect of a novel. She is not characterized. We don't really have a sense of her as a person. We hear things about her from others, and so there's a kind of floating collage of Lukey, but it never attains weight or substance.
But at the same time, she is very the novel refuses introspection. These characters are not Proust. I mean, despite the title, which sounds like it's Proust and this is not about people trying to connect with their own inner selves. And Modiano says in that pedigree memoir that he also wasn't interested in figuring out why his mother and father were the way they were, that it has taken place, it's past, and he's not interested in reflecting on it. And, we have often a tendency as readers of novels to expect deep characterization and deep psychology. But this is a kind of Camus, he's writing in the wake of Albert Camus, as you read The Stranger, you try to get into the mind of Rousseau, it's all actually resisting this kind of Proustian introspection. And so what's interesting to me about her is that she has a very strong sense of not belonging anywhere. Her mother actually ends up not abandoning her, but giving up on her, because she realized that her daughter was exactly like she was. So it's like she's not going to go anywhere. And she has this nostalgia for elsewhereness.
Yeah.
And you read that passage where she wants to get to the top of the mountain, and then there's a void on the top, and let herself experience the weightlessness of being in the void. So she's deeply drawn to an elsewhere that is not on this earth, and that makes her, if not interesting, quite fascinating. There's a difference between fascinating and interesting.
I would say how can I say I liked her? I guess I sort of fell for her in a way, the way others do, the other characters do. And I think, Toby, you're absolutely right. We get at her, although she has her own narrative, she does, this is interesting, but we get at her, from the other people's point of view, and we like her. I mean, clearly the detective is very interesting. He's hired to find her. And as he learns more about her, and what we learn through him, he really becomes a kind of protector of her. There's a wonderful quotation. He becomes her protector. He's not going to do his detective job, turn her in or get her to the husband. He's going to, and I mentioned Madame Chedley says, "Oh, she was my favorite." And they're thinking back on the, so everybody seems to like her. So I guess I kind of fell for that. But I like what you were saying, Robert, that there's something that you're right. It's not the grounded person we want, but it's actually the ungrounded person that makes her interesting. She it's not like she won't settle. And also at the end of the book, when she killed herself, I didn't feel like she killed herself the normal way you would imagine it would be out of some desperation. No, it's not, and that's a very intriguing way to think about going. She's just not going to let go, but it's not like, remember they're going to go on a holiday. Everything looks cool. The Roland is going to go to Mallorca, right? They get some offer in some place in Mallorca or something. They're going to do all of these wonderful things. And so that's why it's surprising, because from the outside, it all looks good. But clearly, whatever it was that the world delivered to her, it wasn't what she wanted. And I love what you say. She was living everywhere, anywhere else. Remember, there's a time when they were talking about neutral zones, and then he says some of those hotels, and he said, well, she says, why don't we live in a hotel, change a hotel every week, and if you remember, they're reading a newspaper, and they come across some sort of article about missing persons, or I can't remember what it's called, the legacy of the non-found. I can't remember the word. Absentees. That's it, absentees. And so they find a name, a guy named Tahid, and she goes out and they start shouting the name out into the street to try to see if they can raise the ghosts of these people. And so there's something playful too about her, sometimes anyway. And she is wise about herself, because she's fairly insistent on the fact that she was really only herself. Imagine to say that about yourself. I'm only myself when I'm running away. And then of course what we're missing is, what are you running away from? And of course some hints that she's running away from these bad guys out there. Mocellini, remember, she crosses the street with him and takes Roland's arm and doesn't want to go there. When they're driving to a neighborhood where she doesn't want to go, she says, I almost opened the door to escape in the car. So there's something like that, but I don't think that's it. I don't think it's a crime. He's trying to run away from the mafia, he's trying to get her. So it remains this kind of existential, what are you running away from? And I'm thinking, well, if you're trying to, I don't want to get too groovy about this, but if you're trying to run away from something, she keeps saying, and life caught up with me. The ups and downs of life caught up with me. And so the only way out of that, right, is to give it away. Otherwise the ups and downs of life are going to get her. So in some sense, she wasn't quite cut out for the world.
Well, I think also with these four different sections of the narrative, we have I think the ones where it's not her voice are quite frustrating. There's a sense of not being able to really get through to her character. Like, why did she do this? Who is Luki? Where is she from? What is she hiding from? And then I think her narrative is actually very satisfying when we get her voice and we get this glimmer of interiority, but then we're still left with so many questions. We don't quite know what happened in the Cantor Cafe. We don't quite know the nature of her relationships with, Jeanette and Mocellini. And we do get to understand that she has this strong desire to run, to escape, to go further, to keep, walking further and further. But we're kind of left with wanting to know more, in the same way that the other narrators are left wanting more. And at the same time, I think in some ways as readers, we actually know more about Luki and her own voice than perhaps some of the other narrators even do, certainly more than the detective. And I also think, just to go off of what Robert was saying about this, strong desire to escape, I think it's significant that one of the first real consequential clues that Casey the detective gets is about, is that clue about her being, arrested twice for vagrancy. Like, that is one of the first kind of concrete biological clues that we get about her. And I think that's also obviously, deeply linked to her character and the strong desire to run and to escape.
Yeah.
One part where I went, that's actually had a character change when I think she was 15, sneaking out of the apartment, and it's like she hadn't really seen the world out there, and she was scared. She was afraid, and that she was going to be caught by her mom. She was going to be caught by her mom. something about a pharmacy and the pills, etc. Mom worked at the Moulin Rouge. But she kept venturing further and further, and she didn't care if the person in the apartment saw her come back in. And then finally, her mother finds out about it and says, "Well, don't let that happen again." And the relationship with the mom really, I don't know, hit me at that point. It's like, does she really care? She was growing. I didn't know that this was going to be reflected later on in the book, but she was gaining confidence. She didn't know what was out there. And it was like she was being reborn to me a little bit. So.
We have some, well, I just want to get to some ones from the Zoom audience too, but
Can we
fine. Okay.
start here and then we have some online?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Back to the title, the word lost, to me, it was about lost youth in the sense of no one had any commitments. And Robert, when you were saying they kind of lost their youth, well, one of the tasks of youth is to sort of sort out what you believe in, what you stand for, what you're committed to, where you're heading. And it seemed as if everyone, except for the poor fellow who was trying to be a student at École des Mines, that to me was a very frustrating part, where people who were coming together to take sort of shallow fake identities and share that. And the idea that wherever I am, where I could say yes, I could commit, I could make the best of it, I could change it, whatever. All I want to do is escape it. But then, the one guy who was actually doing something, going to school for some reason that wasn't explained, they didn't like that. And so to me, the idea of lost youth is that it just seemed like a picture of lack of commitment, lack of anything that is grounding you, that you stand for, that you believe in. And it's pretty tragic, really. And the idea that these people are coming together to support each other and being that way, the detective was a little bit different because he had integrity in his job. He was being paid to do something, but he thought it was wrong. And so he refused to do it and he did something else instead. But it didn't seem as if I was seeing a lot of kind of integrity or commitment or standing for anything in anybody else. And with the title, you kind of think, well, that was intentional because that's the portrait of what it is.
Like a purpose.
Yeah, for sure.
So when I'm thinking about it also in the Café of Lost Youth, with the Lost Youth part for Luki is that her innocence is being taken from her by Jeanette, because when she's like describing the snow and she's like describing it like a child, how she sees it. And then also when she says, oh, I could have, I only needed one drink, but she gave me two. It's like that peer pressure and then just wanting to seek the approval of someone else. And then if you look on page 60, I think I really feel bad for her character at this point, because it says when she's reflecting on her mother and her mother says to her, you walk too fast, she told me. I've since had a realization. Perhaps I was trying to incite her to go a bit beyond the sheltered life she led. If she hadn't died, I think I might have succeeded in helping her expand her horizons. And the book that she carries is Lost Horizon. So I'm just trying to make that type of connection there. And I think there is more to her than, just the elusiveness. There is a caring person in there, but just wants love.
Shall we get a couple from the Zoom? Okay.
We have a whole army of people online.
We don't want to neglect our Zoom people. Oh boy, we're getting lots more. Just a second here. 'Cause Here's one from Svetlana Brodsky. Hello, if I may ask the distinguished panel, if you had to define in one sentence how time works in the Café of Lost Youth, what would you say? And why does staying in the same streets become a form of disappearance rather than stability?
One sentence.
What was the operative that does what?
One sentence that does what, Cynthia?
If you had to define in one sentence how time works in the Café of Lost Youth, well, okay.
How about one word? Kaleidoscopically.
This is not one sentence, but one of the things when you second time I read it, and this was pointed out by Toby and Chloe both, time starts to play. It looks like they're talking about now, and then it moves to the past, and it moves in and out in a very interesting way, and also how people move from third person to second person. Roland in particular, all of a sudden you're going, you wait, well, how did you get in there? So it's just as you said, it's one is, it may be confusing, but it also is sort of the way I think it operates. You know, we carry on this internal dialogue and we move in between remembering and being where we are right at the moment.
I would say similarly. I think I see it as an oscillation between memory and the present.
I'm also very intrigued by the time of her narration. I mean, frankly, you know, she's dead at the end of the book. But when is she writing? When is she?
She writes as if she's not dead. I mean, she does. When you read it, it doesn't look like she's a ghost. I mean,
she's still right. She's still in life, but we don't know when.
Not right.
Exactly. No. And so there's a word that I would try to answer, not as question, but I'm word it's not coming to me, but it's some kind of the very first sentence of her narrative. When I was 15 years old, you would have thought I was 19, even 20. So I think in French it would be a décalage. Décalage is also a word for, you know, jet lag. When you're in one time zone, you're in another, but your body is out of sync with its own temporality. So I would say the décalage would be the word for her in the temporality.
It's interesting that Modiano chose Luki as the name of this character. I wouldn't want to push this too hard, but I can't help thinking of Loki, the Norse god of disunion, mischief, the author of tragedy also, and a kind of trickster, putting a wrinkle in everything that happens in that world.
That's giving a lot of credit to the author. I authors as just off things that come across, and I think that I've always assumed that he heard about, was in a cafe where they're calling some girl Luki.
There you go.
Although you know there are other names like remember you mentioned Jeanette, her friend, who's sort of, remember Roland says maybe that was some secret life she had, and he's sort of worried about their relationship in some ways. And of course she's there when she kills herself. But her nickname is clearly pictured Crossbones, and that's not some accident. I mean, that's what Luki may be.
Yeah, sometimes a pipe is just a pipe.
Luki is on her real name, Jacqueline Devon, but that's on her name. She has another one also, her married name. You talked about these characters in the cafe who have different names. It's kind of paranomasia is the word for that, but there's a way that the narrative is also paranomastic in the sense that they say, well, okay, they were at the Café Cantin, but what were they doing? They're serving drinks, but there's a strong kind of suggestion that perhaps these are prostitution. They're living in a hotel here. So Modiano does not give us, he gives us sketches, adumbrations, but he doesn't give us the whole picture. So we have no idea what was going on behind the scenes that might have, led to the suicide or what the relationship that he had with Jean-Ed. It seemed to be also very intimate. And they shared more in common than just some kind of, friendship. So.
I want to say something that's apart from the interpretations. I appreciate it. This is not an against interpretation comment. It's something different, which is just the experience of reading the book, what it felt like to read it. I think it's a remarkable book, and I've never read anything quite like it. It felt something really new to me, and the part of the experience that struck me was that it was the revisiting Paris. Probably most people that have read the book or will read the book have been to Paris sometime or spent some time there. And I was there for some months in the 60s. And it was somehow the craftsmanship of the way he took us through the neighborhoods and the sites and the cafes. It captured a time and a place in an incredibly evocative way. And knowing full well as I read it that I've changed, Paris has changed, but that was a very special moment. And I have a feeling that there was something, this is a non-literary comment because I don't know how he did it with the craftsmanship. But as I said, I've read a lot of books about places. You can read Dickens about London. You can read all kinds of, but I've never had this kind of experience of this idea. I mean, and it did feel like a little bit like this eternal return that you're kind of going back to a time in your life and a place. But what I'm saying is it's not an interpretive comment. It's just, it was a feeling that reading the book gave me that I thought was remarkable and very special.
Yeah, and he would love to hear that, I think, Modiano, because so much of the problem is not capturing, fixing it, but how can you bring the past to life again? It's gone in one sense, but it's still there. It's still there, but it's there in spirit, and so it's a spirit that, if I understand what you're suggesting, that there's a spirit to the narrative that brings the presence of that.
One of the first descriptions of her in the cafe is that she's gone, but her perfume remains. I don't mean the perfume she's wearing, but her perfume, her scent, and that actually there's a lot of that in the book. A sense that you can contact it or re-find it, and it's not corporeal, but it's present.
And I think off of that, I think the scene that struck me the most in terms of the way Modiano captures the movement through the city is the scene towards the end. It's on page 99, where he's talking about, Roland is talking about this, promenade that he took with Lucie all the way from Étoile, and he kind of retraces the walk from Étoile to the Rue de Rivoli to the Palais Royal, and then ending up at the Arsenal, which if you know Paris, that's going from the northwest near the Champs-Élysées all the way to the first arrondissement where the Palais Royal and the Louvre is, and then all the way to the Marais, actually, where the Arsenal is. And that is quite a long walk. I was kind of curious. I looked it up on Google Maps to see what they estimated the walk would be. And it would be approximately an hour and 15 minutes. But I think that's actually quite quick. I think it would take longer to make that whole trajectory. And I think there is a way in which you really kind of get that sense of moving through the city in the physical and urban environments.
One more audience question, or Zoom audience question. Tobias Wolff has said that books give you a kind of companionship in the world. How do the panelists interpret Modiano's creation of companionship for the reader? Given the elusive nature of the characters, what kind of companions do we find in them? That's from Brindy Beach.
I think for me, Paris is the companion that I found in the book. And I think that, we've talked a lot between the panelists about Paris as the protagonist. And I think that if anything, that's what, as a reader, what I found for companionship in the novel.
It's an authentic bond. I don't know, it's some kind of connection. Doesn't defy forces of science, but it's.
Yeah, in fact, he says, I think you can believe him. More or less. He says it was like they were, when they met, they were like two unmoored people. They found each other, they were alone. He actually talked about many times, if you'll notice, she'll take his arm and hold on to it tight, even though she's a woman who wants to always let go. And this isn't exactly companionship, but I don't know if it struck you. There's one, I think only one. There are hints of something, like you pointed out, what's going on in the back room and all that. But there's one tiny little passage of erotics. Do you remember? Just tiny. It's at the bottom of page 109. It's not even a passage, it's a sentence. He's doing the eternal return, which you were describing at the end of that thing. The same routine has always got the key to your room from the front desk, the same steep stairwell, like ups and downs, the same white door with its number 11, the same anticipation. And then, quelle surprise, the same lips, the same scent, your hair cascading down the same way. That's the only little glimmer of, but it is Lukey and it is him, and I don't think he's inventing it. I think that's something. And remember, she does kind of leave her husband more or less for him or something like that. And they are together a lot and they're planning a life and all that sort of thing. So there's certainly some notion of connection there. And I think that's what's surprising. It sure so surprised Roland. We're going to go on a holiday. What happened? She's out the window.
Well, that's a great place to conclude our. Yeah, Corey, you got the last word.
This isn't really a question. You guys didn't discuss Guy Debord at all, did you? Guy Debord?
Yeah, Guy Debord.
Was that part of the discussion?
We haven't talked about it, but he's very impressive.
I think that it was loosely based on Guy Debord's circle, but I wonder if this guy, Guy Debord character is really Guy Debord, or if it's just kind of like this generic repetition of this old archetype of a Parisian kind of magician, centering magician literary figure.
Guy Debord is a movement called situationists. He was known for a kind of theory of, in French, la dérive, which is a wandering around the streets. In this case, it was Paris, because he was a Parisian, and this whole psychogeography, as it was known, that you could, the psyche is embedded in a place. And of course, Guy Debord is mentioned in the epigraph, and it's not just Guy. I was not able to find any place where Guy Debord says this.
It's from a film, apparently. It's from a film, apparently.
It's from a film.
Apparently.
Yeah, apparently, but I wasn't able to verify that either. What I do know is that buried in this epigraph is a very strong allusion to Dante. At the halfway point of the journey, making up real life, we were surrounded by a gloomy melancholy, one expressed by so many derisive and sorrowful words in the Café of Lost Youth. So this is, the Selva Oscura, and that is, voyage down to the underworld. So Guy Debord in the book is a strong presumption that he's a figure of Guy Debord who used to hold these meetings with his clan. And then there's also apparently a book of photographs. It's called Love on the West Bank by the Dutch photographer His name is Ed Van. There's something or something of that sort, and there are all these photographs. Guy Debord is supposed to be in the photographs. I haven't been able to identify. So if you want to go to the subtext, there are plenty of subtext. I was completely astonished listening to Rush that these people were real writers. I would never imagine that he would have used real writers' names, for this.
Yeah, actually, could I just read a little description, Martin Essen's description of Adamov, whom he interviewed, and he clearly took a fancy to him. And then the year after he was dead, Adamov was dead after the book. Just real quick. So this is a description of Adamov. Slight, dark, with piercing, probing eyes in a saturnine face, no longer a ragged figure roaming Paris in abject poverty, but still preferring to live in a small left bank hotel and holding court in his favorite cafe on the Boulevard Saint-Germain.